Listeners, are you ready for your monthly literary adventure? We now have the BFF Book Club. Join us each month to explore a new book. After reading, connect with fellow book lovers and meet the author in a live interview. Can't make it live? Don't worry. We'll send you the recording. You can find all the upcoming book club selections at www.bookishflights.com/read/BFF Book Club. Hi, I'm Cara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, we have Tracey Lange joining us for the BFF Book Club. Tracey was born and raised in New York City before heading west to graduate from the University of New Mexico with a degree in psychology. After owning and operating a mental health services company with her husband for 15 years, she completed the Stanford University novel writing program while working on her first novel, the New York Times bestseller, Are the Brennans. Tracey currently lives in beautiful Bend, Oregon, with her husband, 2 sons, and beloved German Shepherd. Welcome to the show, Tracey.
Hi. Hi, Cara. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, I feel like we are so much more than these bios. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. And I keep meaning to update that because unfortunately we don't have our German Shepherd anymore.
Oh,
She passed away last fall.
that's so hard.
So I know, and I think that I purposely haven't changed that yet. I'm not ready to.
Yeah.
But yeah, originally an East Coaster. I was born and raised in the city, but I've been out west for a long time now, in Bend for the last 10 years or so. And I've also been writing for about 9 or 10 years. It's kind of a second career for me. I was in the mental health field for about 20 years. And then when I stepped away from that and we made the move to Oregon, boys were in high school or middle school and I had time. And so I kind of just jumped in full time to writing. So yeah, it was about 9 years ago.
Okay.
So, yeah.
At that point, were you still working in the mental health? Were you doing these simultaneously or had you completely switched over?
I had completely left that field. We actually ended up starting our own business within that field. And it was great. We learned a lot. It grew, which was exciting. And we were able to sell it and step away. So it was great work. It was hard work.
Yeah.
But as soon as we stepped out of that, I thought, well, this is kind of my chance. If I'm gonna do this, I need to get on it. So,
Yeah.
so I just jumped in full time, and I've been doing it ever since.
That's wonderful. My husband is also a physical therapist. I know I mentioned to you before we started that I was too, and people are always like, why don't you guys open your own practice? And we're like, because we like to go on vacation
Yeah,
together.
yeah, it was a lot of work, a lot of work. It was great, and but yeah, tons of work. It kind of takes over for a
Yeah.
while.
Yeah, absolutely. And him being in the military, it's like we haven't totally put our life on hold for 20 years, but we will have, in a way, like in
Yeah,
a sense, it's kind of
yeah,
like we've been transient for 20 years by that point. So I'm like, I think we just want to just move on
yeah,
at
yeah,
that point. And, he can do what he wants to do and same, vice versa. So,
yeah.
well, you have here, we're going to talk about what happened to the McCrays, which is your latest novel that just came out. So
Mhm.
can you tell the listeners that haven't read it a little bit about it?
Sure. Basically, this book takes a really close-up look at a divorce. Two people that met and fell in love and built a life together for a number of years. And then, like so many marriages, unfortunately, it stopped working. And when the book opens present day, they've been divorced for a while. They're living separate lives, separate coasts, actually. And what kind of kicks the story off is Kyle, our divorced husband, is called back home to his hometown in upstate New York because his dad has had a stroke and needs some help. And so that brings him back into his ex-wife's world. She lives across the street, and so it's a really small town, and so it's from there they kind of have to learn how to sort of navigate being back in this small area where they had a life together for so long.
Yeah.
So it's a dual point of view book. I knew I wanted that from the beginning, so we could dig in from both sides, both perspectives, and it's also a kind of a dual timeline book as well. So we take a look at kind of what brought them together in the first place, and then eventually like what happened to end this marriage.
Yeah. And I loved that piece because that for me is what kept me page turning. I was like, what's going to happen and how did this end? Because it seemed like, there was some respect that was still lingering there between the two throughout, there was like a bit of and I'm like, well, what happened? And so I was just page turning to find out like how did it fall apart?
Yeah.
And that piece of that.
Yeah, that was the idea. And I didn't know when I started the first draft. I did not know why they divorced. I knew them, the characters fairly well. And I figured it out as I went, but it definitely took me in some unexpected directions.
Yeah. So I know people will say like the plotter versus pantser. Like, do you have, like, which one are you for that?
I'm definitely somewhere in the middle. I don't outline. I never know how my books are going to end. Um, I usually spend a lot of time just thinking and living with the characters, thinking about them for a long time before I write the first draft. And I'll have some idea of certain plot points that may or may not make the cut. But on the other hand, I'm sort of slow. I definitely like to know where I'm going. This scene, this chapter I'm working on, I really want to know what needs to happen there. I don't just sort of like free write, so I'm definitely somewhere in the middle, but no outlines.
Yeah. Yeah, because I always find it so interesting not being a writer myself when I've had a couple other authors say too, like, I didn't know how it was going to end. Like, I kind of knew 70% of the story, and then the last 30% surprised even me. And I'm thinking, wow, I didn't realize that would be a thing. I would think in your mind you would know.
Yeah, some people do. Some people
Yeah.
outline the whole thing and they know their ending and that works for them. But so far, this has kind of been my approach.
Yeah. Do you find that having been in the world of mental health, it's made it a bit easier to maybe write characters' perspectives or from their point of view, having lived in the world of mental health and helped people through that?
I think so. I think all of that work feeds my writing now. We worked with people from all walks of life, dealing with all kinds of issues,
Yeah.
children, teenagers, adults. So we were exposed to just so much, so many families struggling with different diagnoses or various situations. So I draw on all of that. There are no storylines or characters that are based on anybody
Sure.
that we worked with, but I think all of that, just working with people for so many years, and getting a glimpse into all their lives and their family situations, definitely fuels my work now.
Yeah, and you do such a great job with character development. I've read all your novels, and I think they're all just so poignant, and you get really a look into their lives and their perspectives, and some of them are hitting rock bottom, but then seeing where they can take that. And you do such a great job with that.
Thank you. That's definitely my focus. That's what I love to dig into, are the people and relationships. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking of all of them. I felt that in there and that emotional piece. But also I'm not sobbing when I'm reading your books either. You definitely pull at my heartstrings. And that's why I think I choose the word poignant, because I definitely feel it, and like kind of that like chest feeling of like, I'm going to cry right now, but I cry over everything. My kids are like, oh, mom's crying again, with a movie or whatever. But
Yeah.
it's in like a very gentle way. Like I leave feeling better after reading your book. And that's why I say that. Like it's not an overly sad book, it's emotional,
Good.
but
Yeah.
not like
Yeah. There's always a
leave you.
balance, especially with this one there, I had to really just try to maintain that balance throughout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have a book that was one of your favorites to write?
It, it was this one. It
Okay.
really was. It was the hardest in some ways, for sure. But it allowed me to draw on little bits from my own life. The hockey team, for instance, as soon as I knew I was going to have this middle school hockey team, I thought of our boys and all their sports, and
Yeah.
And so their names are in there, and I used their friends' names and things like that were really just kind of made it special. And I was able to just draw a lot on my experience as a wife and a mom. I've not been through what these characters have been through, but
Sure.
um, it was nice to spend time doing that. And so the story became quite personal. And yeah, so I think, and I had a certainty with this one about where it needed to go. And I'm sure some of that comes, with it being the third book. You learn so much from each book, um, but yeah, I would say this is probably a little bit of my favorite. This one.
Yeah. And I think we hadn't even talked about that sports piece, but I think anybody that has either played sports themselves, especially, right, or like you said, been the parents of the sports teams, there was such a fun component of that piece. It's like you're cheering for this hockey team in the background.
Yeah, yeah, they were so fun to write, and I knew
Yeah.
they would just be an opportunity for warmth and humor. They're middle schoolers, right? They're just so fun. It's such a rough age. But they generally just say what they're thinking very often. They don't have the filter yet, or so anyway, that was a really fun piece to write, their storyline.
Yeah. There was definitely moments that made me laugh out loud. So it was
Good,
definitely a
good.
lighthearted, fun component to the book. What have you learned about yourself through writing?
Um, I think a lot, but I would say that the thing that I learned about myself, or one of the many things, but this is a big one, was that I could put this out in the world, and which is a really vulnerable feeling.
Oh, yeah.
I've told people it's a little bit like walking out into the world naked, or just bearing your soul. And as a writer, there are some people it's just not going to work for them.
Sure.
There are people that are going to give you bad reviews or ratings or whatever, so you know that going in, but it's still a little scary to kind of put it out there. And so I've learned that I could survive that. I
Yeah.
guess. So that was a big one for me.
Yeah, I had one of my guests earlier this year. She had come on, and because I always think of these as like your babies that you're putting out into the world.
Yeah.
And she had the funniest quote, and it stuck with me. She's like, and nobody's rating your baby on Goodreads. And it has
Right.
stuck with me ever since of like, it's so true. Like you're putting this thing out there for everybody to, potentially critique or review or have their reflections on or
Right.
feedback.
It's
And
part of it. It is so
yeah,
subjective. You and I could agree on 99 books and then have a totally different take on the last one. So I know that going in, and certainly don't seek out negative reviews. And usually people are kind enough not to tag you if they are writing
yeah,
a negative review. Um, but yeah, that was a big one, was just to, because they are like your babies. You spend so much time, and
yeah,
you put so much into the characters and the story. And so it is scary to put out in the world. And but you learn, like, okay, I can deal with the bad reviews or whatever it might be.
yeah. Or just not read them. I feel like,
Right.
no.
I mean, they kind of come your way occasionally anyway, even
Yeah,
if so you do hear some of it for sure.
sure.
But yeah, that was, it's good to know I can get through that. It's not fun, but I can
Yeah,
survive that. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, what is your wish for readers when they pick up what happened to the McCrays? What do you hope they take away from the story?
You know, I hesitate to say too much about that, because I'm often surprised what people take away
Sure.
from my books, and I love that. But I think that with McCrays, as well as my other two books and one I'm working on now, um, I just love diving into the gray. I feel like so little in life is black and white, and or right or wrong. And it just, the idea of walking in someone else's shoes, looking at a situation from different perspectives. For instance, in this story, we look at this marriage from both sides, from kind of from beginning to end of their relationship and marriage. And I just think that's so important, that idea, if it can really get at that idea that there's room for two truths. think that was Mark Twain that said that.
Okay.
I might be wrong, but that's what I love to get at in my books. And so I guess it's a way of building empathy, right? But just that idea of looking at the situation from other people's perspectives, because you never know, everyone deals with their emotional pain and in different ways. And so, yeah, I think that's probably what I hope people occurs to people while they're reading my books.
Yeah. And we really can never know either, right? I mean, we can develop empathy, but we are never walking through in their shoes, right? Like you can try your best and try to understand and have empathy, but
right. But that goes a long way,
Yeah.
just trying to understand and, so it feels like we could use a little more of that in the world right now.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite reasons for reading. I always love to try to put myself like into the character and be like, well, would I react the same with like a similar set of circumstances? I find myself asking that often as I read.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people react so differently, and we're all shaped by different things. And so, yeah, that's one of the reasons I've always loved reading. I love to be able to get into somebody else's head for a while and see how they react to things.
Yeah. Well, I know this book is still kind of recently out. I mean, it's been about 2 months out.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any upcoming projects or books that you're working on?
I do. I have one that I'm kind of in the thick of now. It's just still first draft, but it's going. And I guess in my mind, it feels like it leans a little toward Brennan's, just in the sense that there's a kind of leaning on the Irish family again, a totally different situation, different place, and adult siblings. It's about adult siblings and their mom, and really they lost their dad a long time ago, but it's under somewhat, they have questions about it. It's not a murder mystery of any kind, but they have questions that have kind of haunted them. And so part of it is trying to answer those questions together. So another messy family.
We all enjoy them. We're going to keep picking them up. So, well, how do you balance reading and writing in your own life?
I'm a pretty good reader. I've always been a pretty voracious reader. And I feel like it's part of the job, if you're going to be a writer. And I try to read across genres. I certainly have my favorites sort of books to that I seek out. But I do try to mix it up a little bit, because everybody offers something different, and it can all kind of help, inform your own writing. So I shoot for about 70 books a year to read, and I do audiobooks. I always have an audiobook going. I know some people don't I love them.
I think they're like the best kept secret
to
like multitasking and reading at the same time.
Yeah, and the narrators these days are so good. So I love audiobooks. So I always have one going. So I shoot for 65, 70 books. I was a little short last year. But anyway, that's my goal.
Yeah. Life happens too, as well within that. Yeah. Well, was there a book that you read along the way that made you want to become a writer?
Early Stephen King books, I think I read those when I was really young. Sure. I might maybe too young. They were, they were
some graphic scary content. Yeah,
but scary. But his characters were, no matter what situation they were in. And I've never really been drawn to horror. It's not really my thing, but his characters always transcended that to me, that part of his book. So, his early stuff had such a impact on me. So I would say those were, and they stayed with me always, and his characters did. So I think that was a huge influence early on. And probably the first one was Pet Sematary. And then I was like, oh gosh, I have to read every book he writes.
Yeah. I know my mom just went back. She told me recently she was going to try to read another Stephen King, because she had read the early stuff and it became too graphic. And I can't remember which one it was, but it was about like a plague, and it was during like COVID times. She's like, it just felt way too close to home. I had to put it down. Like it was.
Yeah, that might be the Dome title. Or The Stand, or
The Stand. I think it was The Stand. And she's like, it was just too close to home with like COVID times. Like this was a couple of years ago. I was like, I couldn't do it.
Yeah.
So Well, have you always been a reader?
Yes. Yeah, I've always been a pretty good reader. So yeah, it's always, I love to read. My favorite classes in college were creative writing, but I never really thought I could actually write a book and
Yeah.
publish a book. So I went another direction for a while. But yeah, I've always been a pretty good reader.
Okay. And
Yeah.
then, well, we've kind of switched gears a little bit. So let's talk a bit more about your reading life and we'll introduce your book flight here shortly. How did you choose the books for your book flight?
Um, I I chose three books that again, my favorite kind of books. They all have these characters that they're good people, they have good intentions, they're tragically flawed. And you find yourself rooting for them even when maybe you shouldn't. you know and I think that that's a if a book can do that for me, I love that. So that was kind of my criteria for these three books. They all have those characters that you're rooting for even when you probably shouldn't, they're doing the wrong thing
Yeah.
or whatever it is. So that's what I based it on.
Yeah, there are books that motivated you to do that, I think,
Yeah.
So what's the
Yeah.
first book you brought today?
The first one is I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb.
Okay.
And he was another one. I talk about Stephen King's early books, but I read that book and I was just, I'm sure some of it was timing. It was a long time ago, but I just was amazed by what I felt for his characters. So that was the first one, and it's about twin brothers, and one is schizophrenic, and
Okay.
one is not, and so it goes from there. But fantastic book.
Yeah, I haven't read this one, so I'm gonna have to add this to my list. I've
Yeah,
definitely heard of.
it's a big one. It's a big one.
All right, so you'll spend some
But
time
yeah,
with it. Good to know.
yes, yeah.
So that was I Know This Much Is True by Wally Lamb. And then what's the next book you brought today?
The next one is The House of Sand and Fog by Andre Dubus III.
Yeah.
They made that one into a movie quite a while ago. People may have seen, but um, again, it's just fantastic characters. The two main characters are from very different worlds, and they end up kind of at war with each other, so to speak, over a certain property. But they both you understand where each one's coming from, and they're both making bigger and bigger mistakes as they try to as they go through this conflict. And but it always stayed with me. I just thought it was a fantastic book.
Yeah, I read that one a few years back and it's funny because right now I'm like only remembering the fight over the property. Like that's the biggest takeaway, but I mean, it was probably, I think my kids, I think it was newborn stage for me. So you know how
Oh
things don't
yeah,
always like stick in the
yeah,
brain, but I'm
yeah,
like, that's the one part I remember was like the fight over the property. It was in San Francisco, right? Was it the Bay
yeah.
Area?
I believe so.
Okay.
I believe so. And they were both so desperate. And you understood, even though
Yes.
you wanted to shake them and say you can't do that, they still were doing it, and you were still kind of rooting for them. So
Yeah, it was like the plight,
yeah,
right? Because one had immigrated to the United States as well, if
yes,
I remember
yeah,
correctly, and just kind of
yeah.
trying to make it here. And so you're like,
And they
yeah,
both had such difficult stories. Anyway, it just I thought it was a great book.
yeah. I remember enjoying it. Now I have to, this is why I love Goodreads. I'm like, I'm gonna have to go back because I've been keeping it for about 10 years. So I have quite a history there. So I'm like, I'm gonna have to go back and remember what I said about that one.
Yeah,
So that was The House of Sand and Fog by Andre Dubus III. And then what's the last book
yes.
you brought today?
The last, certainly not least, is All the Ugly and Wonderful Things by Bryn Greenwood,
Okay.
which when it came out, it definitely was a little controversial. And I know people that stopped reading it. It bothered them too much what was going on, and they weren't willing to take the ride. I always recommend it for book clubs because at the very least, it's some really interesting discussions come out of that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of about found family, but it is definitely a situation where these characters you care about them so much and you're rooting for them, even though really you shouldn't be. So I'll kind of leave it there. But it was a
Yeah.
fantastic book. Yeah.
Without giving away too much of the book.
Yeah,
So we'll all go
yeah.
pick it up.
But
Okay,
but
so
but forewarning, some people it can be it can be quite controversial. So
What
okay.
was the name of the book again?
all the all the ugly and wonderful things.
Yeah,
Thank
by
you.
Bryn Greenwood.
Bryn
Yeah, Bryn.
Greenwood.
I was like, I think I said that wrong. I forgot to tell you ahead of time, which like this, I'm going to edit this out. I do edit all my episodes, which I did tell you, so we can take out whatever like doesn't work.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so
Okay.
like I'm like I can come in here and say as an aside, like, oh yeah, well I forgot to mention
Good.
that.
Okay. Good.
But so far
Perfect.
so good. It's been great. But
Yeah.
well, Kathleen, do you have any questions you'd like to ask? I'm sure, I mean, you have access to Tracey all the time, but
Yes, I do. Fortunately, yes. One question I had, you already asked about the influence of the work in the healthcare industry and how that helped you with your characters and maybe helped you understand people. And I've never been in that industry, but I can imagine walking away from it would have you, or being in it would have you kind of, to me, it would say there's no 100% right or wrong. People,
No, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I think I've always been I've always been studied human nature, and that was part of that work. And so being exposed to so many people, different families, and so many issues they were dealing with and how they were dealing with them. And so yeah, it's just, I just kind of dove into all of that humanity. and and I love to do that with my characters. So I think it helped, but I've always kind of been so curious about people and why they do what they do, what our motivations are. Especially when, we know better and we still make bad decisions. And why do we do that? So all of that is just really fun for me to get into. But being in the mental health field, you saw so much of that up close. So it certainly fuels the work now. Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Kathleen, because one of the overarching themes, I think, of the podcast is a lot of people have transitioned careers from previous guests that have been on. And, one thing I always recommend is like thinking outside the box for your skill set. Because I know leaving a career that you've had forever is kind of scary to do, to think about, well, what could I do to start something new? But did you find skills that had transferred from your previous job to being a writer?
Yeah, and there was a lot of writing in that work.
Yeah.
Everything from sort of legalese stuff, but also for many years I wrote psychosocial assessments where you sat down with the families and you got their story,
Yeah.
and you had to kind of record it and write up an assessment and kind of help them figure out what they needed help with. So I did a lot of writing all those years. It wasn't fiction, but certainly it helped my writing skills.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then again, just the deep dive into people and what makes us tick.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think I wanted to highlight that because it's been a theme over and over again on the show of
Is
just
that
like our
right?
skills
Okay.
can translate into so much more. If you want to make a career transition, you might just have to think outside the box. I've found that
Mm-hmm.
physical therapy
Mm-hmm.
very similar, right? We interview patients all the time. I mean, that skill has translated so well to podcasting. I'm like, I would
Yeah,
never
sure.
have thought.
Mm-hmm.
And just I loved talking with people in the clinic. That was like one thing I did miss when I left. And I've
Mm-hmm.
gotten to do that through podcasting. I'm like, I still
Right.
kind of get that little scratch the itch a little bit and have that piece of it.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And a lot of people come to writing in particular later, and you kind of just have more to say, probably, or a
Yeah.
better way to say it.
Well,
Yeah.
that or I think just life experience too, right? I
Yeah,
think it allows
exactly.
you
Yeah.
to translate it to the page a lot
Mm-hmm.
more than,
Mm-hmm.
when I was 20, I was way more naive, or
Yeah.
just not have
Yeah.
experience or wisdom to share or,
Right.
bring forward.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, well, any other questions, Kathleen?
I don't think so. I mean, I know when I read Tracey's books, which I love, I'm always trying to figure out if they relate to anybody I know.
Okay, so listeners, Kathleen is her mom. Yeah, so she has a unique look into all of Tracey's books as well.
Right, right. And
Yes.
there have been times when there'd be a character, I go, that sounds a little bit like, but nothing that's kind of, jumped out, go, oh, that's me. No, 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 no. Just me.
No.
her dad and brother and just different people that we know, So I haven't been successful at that, but I have to admit, I guess because she's my daughter, it does come up to me for me when I read her books.
Yeah.
That sure.
And
and I think we draw on all of that. Little bits of, I'm sure there are things you recognize and friends would recognize from my own story, things like that. But yeah, no one's based on anyone in particular.
Well, and it's your life, back to it's your life experience, right? And when you're writing, I mean, it's hard to kind of shut off your life experience when you're writing too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's all makes you who you are and who you are as a writer. So that's all going to contribute to that piece. Mm-hmm. Do you have a favorite scene from what happened to the McCrays? I don't know. That might be kind of hard if you don't want to give too much away to the listeners, but that was a favorite to write.
I will say that a couple of the then chapters, meaning the backstory, earlier timeline chapters, I really enjoyed a couple of those just when they were young. And because it kind of gets into what drew them together, back in the day. And they met quite young, and, young love is always intense. So it was just kind of fun to be able to spend a little time doing that and giving them a nice start. So a couple of those chapters they definitely stood out to me a little bit.
Yeah, we didn't mention either the small town piece of that. And I grew up in a pretty small town, and just how everybody knows your business, right? And just how he felt like he kind of had to go. It wasn't just leaving the marriage and his family, the town was involved in him.
Yeah.
He left.
Yeah. That's actually been one really nice part of this whole experience was people reach out from Potsdam. They're always like, why Potsdam? Because they're like, we thought you'd be from here, but and I just knew what I was looking for in terms of the size of the town, and I wanted a winter town. And so when I found Potsdam, it just seemed to fit the bill. And then we visited, and that's kind of sealed the deal for me. But I have had a lot of people reach out and just say, okay, you got it right. And that feels pretty good. So that's been nice. I did a little talk with the North Country Public Radio up there a while ago. And, he just talked about being in certain locations in Potsdam while he was reading the book. And so that's kind of cool when you can make that connection with people. Yeah.
Yeah, because the other people, they'll write a fictionalized town, which doesn't give them that connection piece. So that's got to be hard to do, and stay true to Potsdam.
Yeah, it's a little scary. There might be people out there of a different opinion, and they probably won't tell me. But yeah, I felt like I knew it well enough at that point that I could do that with Potsdam. So, and it's great. It's going to always be special to me for that reason now too.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I have a question of, one of the things that really, besides the great story, was texting Tracey after, with an emotion or a feel about, as I read the book, right? And I know you can't do that but it was a unique experience to be able to correspond with the author as you were reading the book. And I was trying to think, how can I recreate that when I don't know the author?
Yeah. Well, I would bet that most authors would still love to hear from you if you can find their email on their website, because Tracey, you could speak to that firsthand, but I've had many people say, I'd love to hear from you about my book. So you could.
Yeah, it's one of the nicest parts of my day when people send an email or reach out on Instagram or even post a picture of you, just talk about what the book meant to them. And I've had a few really powerful emails from people that have been through some of what these characters have been through. And that's very humbling. But yeah, I mean, even if someone just reaches out to say, I really enjoyed the book, or so yeah, feel free to look up their email. And I don't know anyone who doesn't appreciate hearing from readers that that's why we do it, is to connect with people, on some way. So
yeah.
Thank you for that suggestion.
Yeah. I think that that's something you do really well, Tracey, is all of our lives are messy. And I think that we can all relate to your novels because in some, again, we all experience this messiness in our lives. So your books are so relatable and don't seem too fictionalized of like, well, that would never happen. You can really put yourself in okay, we're not alone out here in our messiness and our chaos.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. if you only take that away, that's great. Yeah.
Well, how I love to end our show here is with our bonus pairings, which are just a speed round of questions that you can answer really quick. So are you a rereader?
Very rarely.
Okay.
Very rarely.
What is one book you've read that has changed your life?
I'm actually going to mention a craft book, a book about writing, because I feel like it did, at least on my writing life, it certainly changed my writing life. And it's called Creating Character Arc by K.M. Weiland.
Okay.
And it's just, if anyone out there is interested in writing or thinking about it, it's a fantastic resource. And I use it. I've been using it for years and years. And so, yeah, that's the book that I would say is, at least on my writing life, has had a huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds great. Where is your favorite place to read?
I will read anywhere, but I read a ton on planes. I just checks. I don't like to fly. So I get there with my book. I read all the way through. It takes me out. The turbulence doesn't bother me as much. So that might be my favorite place to read, but I really can read just about anywhere.
Yeah. And there's not really much place you can go on an airplane. So it's like you're kind of stuck in the seat anyway.
Yeah.
Like you might as well read.
So. Yes. I've read, long flights. I've read the whole way through. And so I do love to read on a plane. Yeah.
Great. And lastly, what are you reading next?
Right now I'm reading Dream State by Eric. I think it's Puckner.
Okay.
It's really, really good.
Okay.
Love it. Yeah.
Is it what genre is it in?
It's another family.
Okay.
Sort of drama, Okay.
I hadn't heard of it. So
yeah, it was, I believe it was Oprah's pick either this month or last month.
Nice.
And I picked it up and it's a great story.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show with me.
Yeah.
Kathleen, Chuck, thanks for joining. This was fantastic.
I know. I had no idea they were jumping on. So there you go.
I'm glad we did.
Yeah. What a great surprise. Well, thank you again. I know your time is precious, so I appreciate all you've given me.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today with Bookish Flights featuring Tracey Lange. Our next meeting of the BFF Book Club is April 27th at 1 p.m. to discuss The Funeral Ladies of Ellery County with Claire Swinarski. This is a heartwarming story of love, life, and casserole set in a Wisconsin community. If you can appreciate Midwest niceness and unique recipes, you will absolutely adore this book. Head on over to our website, bookishflights.com, to find out more and sign up for our next meeting. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.